In this penultimate unit, we start to wrap up the course. We talk about implementation and enforcement. We started out talking about how to develop policies, how to organize policies, sort of the different parts and how everything relates to each other, and the mechanisms of building these IT security policies. Then, in the second part of the course, we started talking about specific policies that we can implement, policies in the area of the user domain, in the infrastructure, risk management policies, data classification, all that stuff that we talked about. And then finally, in this week, we start to wrap this up a little bit. We talk about how to implement those policies. So we've got all these policies, at this point in our, in the process, we've developed the policies, we've written the policies, we've got everything ready to go. Now we have to actually start to implement those policies and at some point start to enforce those policies. So implementation and enforcement, of course, go hand in hand. But one of the things that our book talks about that's important to keep in mind is to try to avoid a sort of a tyrannical approach to implementing and enforcing these policies. So in our book, they talk about implementation is as much about changing attitudes as it is about implementing controls. One technique you could take is, okay, we've got all these policies now, everyone has to follow them, and you make it a requirement that everyone has to follow these policies, and of course we want to do that, but I think it's important that that in addition to actually creating these policies, one of the important things we want to do is try to change the culture of the organization and try to make them more security aware. And make them, help people to think about security, give people the tools to be more secure and to think about what the ramifications are with data security. And, in their book, they talk about this idea of implementing in a way that wins hearts and minds. And, and that's certainly one of our goals. It'll make our life a lot easier if people don't feel burdened by these policies, but rather feel empowered by the policies, feel like there's some ownership over those policies. I think it goes without saying that if you try to force policies down people's throats, they're going to be a little less likely to follow those policies, or they're going to find ways around those policies. I always bring up the example of drugs. I think, I'm certainly not saying that everyone should go out and take drugs, but I think we all know that even though marijuana is, for the most part, still illegal in this country, although who knows, in another couple of years, maybe it won't be, but it's still illegal, but people still do it. I mean, everybody, I'm not saying I have, but a lot of people still smoke marijuana anyway. A large percent of the population continues to use marijuana or has used marijuana, even though it's illegal. And it's not, minor illegal. Some, marijuana can, can come with some jail time and significant fines. So even though there's a law in the books that says that you shouldn't do it, a lot of people do it anyway. So, it's not really helping. And I think it's because people don't really see the point in it. A lot of people think, well, marijuana is not dangerous. It's not any worse than alcohol. In fact, alcohol, most studies have shown that alcohol is actually worse than marijuana, but yet alcohol is legal. So, so people do it anyway. And, here's the reality is look at countries like Saudi Arabia where, using marijuana is illegal and comes with a death sentence. Does that stop people from doing it? No, there's still people doing it. So you can never stop it. But one thing you can do, but, laws that make sense to us, laws that, we all kind of can agree with, like drunk driving laws, for example. A lot of us drink alcohol and, it's something that most people do. But most of us don't drink alcohol and they get behind the wheel of a car. And I think it's partially because of the law, but the law kind of reminds us that it's important not to do that. Talking on your cell phone while driving, I think a lot of us do that too. But, the law reminds us that it's not a good idea to do that. And it's trying to change that culture. Here in New Jersey, where I live, they just decided that our cell phone laws, it's instead of being a $100 fine for using your cell phone, now it's going to be $200. And on the second offense, $400. The third offense, $600. So they're trying to develop this culture where people understand the risks of using a cell phone. And the state didn't just come out and say, hey, we're going to do this to raise revenue. They did a big marketing push to say, hey, using your cell phone while driving is extremely dangerous. Here's all the statistics. We want everybody to stay safe while they're driving their car, so we're going to increase the fines to try to entice people to stop doing that. So same thing with seat belts and things like that. So IT security implementation, we kind of got to think about it the same way. We have to consider, what can we do to try to help people understand why we have these policies and try to change the culture a little bit to get people to understand security awareness and think about the ramifications of what they're doing and, hopefully reduce the number of incidents. So a few more practical techniques for more or less selling security, and your book uses that term. They talk about this idea of selling security. How do you convince people that it's a good idea to adopt these policies that you've developed? So the first method they talk about is personal accountability. So the idea here is that one thing that's pretty obvious is that if you're in a organization that is regulated, that has some kind of government regulation or even industry regulation, the executives can be held liable for infractions with those regulations. So, for example, with HIPAA and Sarbanes-Oxley and things like that, we all remember, the cases back in the 90s when executives were going to jail, like Kenneth Lay and so forth. So there's some personal accountability here. I think while I'm recording this, we're probably seeing this at the IRS right now. They lost a whole bunch of emails, and somebody's probably going to get fired for that. So, they didn't have good policy to prevent that from happening. So having good IT security policy can help provide a framework for leadership to be sure that they are in compliance with these regulations, and you can use that as a kind of a sales technique to say, hey, if we adopt these policies and we enforce these policies, then it's it's going to be good for us because it's less likely that you're going to that we're going to inadvertently violate any of these regulations and things like that. So the consequences are pretty high for executives, but rather low for rank and file employees. So at the executive level, I think you can certainly do personal accountability. At the rank and file level, you would use directive and enforcement. So you're basically saying, hey, we have to abide by these policies because executive management says that this is a good idea and this is what we should be doing. So it's kind of a multi-layered approach. If we start at the top with personal accountability, we get executive management behind these policies, then executive management can set the tone for directive and enforcement. And then finally, we have being a valuable tool. So not only can IT security policy be important for the personal accountability piece for executive management, but for rank and file, it can be a good tool to ensure that fraud doesn't happen, to make sure that people don't steal information, that intellectual property doesn't get lost. I think most of us, when we work somewhere, we don't want to see things get stolen. We don't want to see revenue getting lost because we know that at some point that translates into less pay for the rest of us. We want to see our companies do well and succeed. So 3 things. We got personal accountability, which we can usually apply towards our executive management, and then we can use that buy-in from executive management to help with directives and enforcement of those policies, to implement those policies, and then we can also talk about policies being a valuable tool. So, for example, certain types of authentication might be, even though they're a pain, things like two-factor authentication, we can sell that by saying, look, it's going to help us reduce fraud. It's going to help prevent your account from getting stolen. It's going to, do all these things that are going to be good for the organization overall. So who are the people that we have to sort of convince to get on board? So I kind of talked about this already, but, at the top, we've got the executive management, which, again, that was the personal accountability we used to try to get them on board. And then we've got frontline managers and supervisors, which are getting that, getting direction from the executives. And then finally, the employees or frontline users, the rank and file, as I keep saying, that actually are putting these policies to practice. So these are the folks that are involved. These are the people that we have to convince to adopt these policies. These are the people that we're trying to change the culture. So 3 different categories of employees within our organization that we usually have to sort of sell on these policies. So some challenges to implementing policies. So first we have accountability. The ultimate accountability for our IT security is accountability for protecting the information for the organization lies with management. If we can't get management to buy in and be accountable to these policies, then it's going to be difficult to really change a culture around these IT security policies, or to try to manage to get to enforce these policies and things like that. So accountability is pretty important. I think one thing that you have to try to do is not have management look at IT security and IT security policy as purely an IT function, but rather um, take a more wide approach and say, okay, everyone is responsible for IT security. It's not just the technology; it's the information that this technology is holding, and it's so valuable to the company or to the organization. So leadership has to really look beyond this being an IT problem and see it as an overall business function. So that's one piece. And of course, that's a really important piece. And then continuing after accountability, lack of budget is another challenge you'll run into. Obviously, all this stuff takes money. It takes budget to pay people to sit down and create these policies, enforce these policies, put in place controls to enforce the policies. So, and as we all know, in many companies, budgets can be tight, and we have to justify that budget. So that's another challenge. Lack of priority. In most businesses, the priority is the core business function, right? So if you're if you're an online retailer, your number one priority is to maintain sales and inventory and shipping and improve all those business processes and so forth. IT security is not the number one thing on your list. So it's difficult because you're always kind of, I think in the IT security world, you're fighting that lack of priority. People have more important things, or their perception is they have more important things to do. So we have to deal with that. And then finally, tight schedules. I think all of us, and all of you that have a job, or I'm sure are aware, you're always being squeezed. Everybody's always working at their maximum output. So when you ask people to do a little bit of extra work, you get a little bit of pushback from that. Sometimes a lot of pushback. And these IT security policies, one thing is you're going to need input from lots of people. So that's one piece where it might be difficult to get people's time because of those tight schedules. The second thing is once you're implementing these policies, which is what we're talking about in this unit, so once these policies are getting implemented and enforced, people have to take extra time to learn the policies, understand the policies, and take the extra steps required to be compliant with the policies. So those tight schedules might make it difficult to do that. And I think a lot of us deal with that. All of us have paperwork in our jobs. I've got tons of paperwork that I'm supposed to do in my job. And a lot of times when I'm busy and I'm on a tight schedule, I just start to shuffle that paperwork to the side and say, I'll get to this later. I've got this system that I'm supposed to track all of my encounters with customers, so all my engagements with various customers in the consulting capacity. I'm supposed to go into this system and describe all of my encounters in those engagements so that they can be tracked and they can make sure that they're billing the customers the right amount and we're not missing any opportunities. And sometimes I just get so busy I don't feel like going in there and doing it. And one day, I'll look in the computer and I'll say, geez, I've got 150 different encounters that I have to update. And by that time, I don't even remember what I did with those customers. So it's important, to try to keep ahead of that and don't let it get ahead of you. But of course, this is going to be one of those major challenges that you come up with these policies, you try to implement them, and people simply aren't doing it because their schedules are too tight. So we have to fight all of these different factors when we're trying to implement policies. And of course, the goal of all this, the final goal of this implementation, as I said in the beginning, is to promote some kind of cultural change to help people be aware of these of these IT security policies and why they're important, and help people do the right thing when they're working with information technology. So make it a routine part of their daily interaction, supported by organizational committees, and instinctively reactive. People instinctively think about, when they're going to do something, they're thinking about the IT security ramifications of doing that. They don't have to go look up the policy to know they're not supposed to do something. They're going to say, I'm probably not supposed to do this because it fits into that, into that framework. So one of the things our book talks about is typical office workers. There was a study done by a reporter who did some surveys. I don't think it was a very scientific survey. I looked at it. The books references it, but I guess anecdotally, it's we can talk about it. But I think he said so. 21% of office workers let their family and friends use computer systems, and so that's we have all these security policy. We can promote this cultural change, but family and friends don't know that culture. They don't know what they should and shouldn't do with company property. So, letting family and friends use company systems, maybe not such a good idea. I think a lot of us take home a laptop for our job. And, it's when it's in your home, this laptop, it's easy to think of it as, it's just another thing in my house and the kids can play games on it or something like that. But, maybe that's not such a good idea. So again, that cultural change would hopefully convince more people help more people think about those ramifications of letting family and friends use computer systems. In my case, my laptop always has personally identifiable patient information on it. So letting my kids play with that isn't such a good idea. And I can tell myself, it's in a folder. They're never going to see it. They're never going to click on that folder. But who knows? And if they do something stupid with that, who knows? Maybe they'll open it up by mistake, a document, mistakenly email it to a bunch of people or something like that, and then that becomes a major incident. So, if you have this culture around security, I think people would say, oh, no, my kids better not play with the laptop because, here's all the things that could happen, and they're thinking about that. According to that study, 51% connect their own personal devices in the workplace. 60% store personal content. So this could be somebody coming in with a USB drive or storing their pictures from their cell phone. I think a lot of us, we can charge our cell phones now with USB. You plug it in, and all of a sudden you can download all your pictures from your cell phone onto your work computer. So, there's reasons why maybe that's not such a good idea. Who knows what kind of pictures some people have on their phones, right? 10% downloaded prohibited content. I'm sure we can all guess what prohibited content could be, but so that's another concern. 62% admit to having very little IT security knowledge. So they basically say, I don't know anything about IT security. So hopefully we could change that with these policies. And 51% this is kind of a basic thing, but they're not sure how to update antivirus. I'd be surprised if that wasn't higher than 51%. And I think I talked about this before in this course that it's surprising how many modern workers and office surroundings don't know technology. They sit in front of a computer all day and use a computer all day, and then they'll tell me, oh, I don't really know much about computers. I've only been sitting in front of a computer for 8 hours a day for the last 22 years, but I don't know much about computers. It seems kind of silly, but some people just don't have the inclination to learn this stuff and to try to think more about the right thing to do with their technology. So obviously IT security policy, this cultural change is hopefully going to change a lot of this stuff in your organization to prevent, all this bad stuff from happening, or bad stuff that could happen from people doing these things that we know are not such a good idea on company property. So a security awareness policy, we've talked about this a little bit before, so we'll review it again. What we can do to help raise the awareness that we've been talking about and try to change that culture, create a security-aware culture. So first we have awareness, and the purpose of awareness is to raise understanding of the importance and the value of security policies. So that's the first thing: is awareness is helping people to keep in the front of their minds, these concerns about IT security. So how do we do that? The best way to do that is for training. So some kind of security awareness training. So in our security awareness policy, we're going to talk about training. And we've talked about this before, but there are certain times when we would where we would do training, or that we would codify into the policy that this is when training is going to happen. So trigger points to say, here's when training is going to happen for IT security policy awareness or IT security awareness. Number one was when a new employee is onboarded. So in that onboarding process of a new employee, you're going to do certain kinds of training, and that might be administered by the HR department. It could be a variety of different things. It could be some documents that the employee has to read. If an employee gets a promotion or a demotion, I suppose, either way. But if an employee makes some kind of a move within the organization, that should trigger some awareness policy training. And it could be, awareness policy training, or the awareness training could be different for different types of employees. So if you're promoted from one area to another area, the type of awareness training that they should be getting might change a little bit. So, so when there's a promotion, that should trigger it. After an incident, so if there's some kind of an incident, our incident response team, as we talked about in the previous unit, identifies some kind of an incident, and there's some kind of training that could have helped prevent that incident. I talked about employees noticing that the file names were strange. Maybe, and that could be simple training. It could just be, we'll talk about ways to train people later on, but somehow we could have communicated that to all the employees after the incident to say, here's something that we could have done to prevent that incident. So after an incident, we could do some additional training. And anytime we have encounters with vendors or contractors. So, I'm a vendor or a contractor in hospitals a lot. And a lot of the hospitals now, before they allow me to work in the hospital, they make me go through some kind of awareness training. It's not very complicated, it's usually just very basic, but it more so sets the tone for the organization. It's not so much about, telling me what I have to do and giving me all these policies and procedures. It's sort of sending a message to me as a contractor that, hey, security is important to us and we expect you to respect that. And that's the message that it sends to me as a contractor or a vendor. Whereas an organization that doesn't do that at all, where I show up to do something for the hospital and they just say, oh yeah, just go through the door and do whatever you need to do. And, nobody asks me any questions. I don't get a security badge. That sends a completely different message about that hospital or that organization. So certainly doing vendor and contractor training could be important for just, again, we're going back to that concept of setting that expectation, setting that security awareness, that culture. So if there's a culture of security by trying to indoctrinate that into our vendors and our contractors. And of course, there's other training too that they usually will make vendors and contractors do. Sometimes it's kind of silly. They'll give you training that has nothing to do with what you're there for. I'm in information technology, and sometimes the vendor or contractor training they make you do talks about how to properly lock out an electrical panel, how to deal with plumbing fixtures and things like that, stuff that I would never be touching. So in that respect, it's good to be aware of your audience, I suppose. How do we, when we're going to deliver training, we want to tailor the approach, as I was just saying, based on the job level, the level of awareness required for that job, and what kind of technical skill that job is going to have. Some jobs are very technical, and other jobs are not technical at all. So, for instance, somebody who works in the shipping department and their only interaction with the computer is to print out the shipping labels and stick them on a box would need a different level of security awareness training than, say, someone who's entering orders and doing financial transactions and things like that. So you certainly want to be aware of the technical skill level when you're talking about how to do this training. And we'll talk more about some of this stuff later, but for delivery of the training, our book talks about two options for training delivery. The cheap way to do it is CBT, or computer-based training, or web-based training, or something like that, where the user basically sits in front of a computer and they review some modules. Not unlike what you're doing right now. You're sitting in front of a computer viewing my PowerPoints, and most of you are probably fast-forwarding through half of them, which is the risk that you run with computer-based training. You don't know how much users are actually paying attention. So, I'll give you an example. Most of the universities and colleges that I teach for make me go through some kind of training. Sometimes it's sexual harassment training. Sometimes it's dealing with dangerous chemicals and how to do workplace safety training. And a lot of times it's computer based, and I just don't have the time to sit through the 37-minute lecture about sexual harassment. So I'll just fast forward through it. And at the very end, they always have a quiz, and they're pretty obvious. It'll say things like, should you, tell women that they're pretty, and should you, touch women inappropriately? Well, of course not. That's pretty obvious. So, I'll get all those answers and end it. So I might spend only a couple minutes doing their training, and, I'm not really doing anything. But the contrast is if you do classroom-based training, which costs a lot more. Classroom training, you have to get in front of people. You have to bring people in somewhere. So, as an instructor for all these local colleges and universities, some of them do require me to go to some training periodically or go to a meeting periodically, and that's expensive for me and it's expensive for them. They have to coordinate the meeting space. They have to have a place for us all to meet. They have to pay somebody to be there. They have to pay us to be there. Um, you know, Whereas with computer-based training, they could just say, "Hey, whenever you have time, go and do this. It's a requirement," and we kind of just do it. Some schools will pay me for that, and some don't, but it doesn't take a lot of time. So again, we could do classroom-based training or CBT. And the other thing about classroom, as an instructor, I can speak to this. In a classroom, it's very easy for me to tell who is paying attention and understanding the material versus who's not paying attention or understanding the material. So there's certainly much more incentive to pay attention in classroom-based training. If you're curious if your training is actually working, a couple methods to get some feedback. You could do surveys. So ask people to fill out a survey. Did the training work? What did you learn? What did you like about it? What did you not like about it? You'll probably get a lot of, the instructor was boring or, et cetera, et cetera. But at least what areas you have to improve. Focus groups, I think, is a little overkill, but you could certainly do focus groups, but seems, for awareness training, like it might be a little too much. Interviews, so you can interview random people about their experience with awareness training, and I think you're trying to understand what they got out of the training, so whether you met the goal. You could do exit interviews. An exit interview is a little different than just a regular interview. This is when an employee is leaving the organization. So somebody quits, somebody gets fired, whatever. They usually do some kind of an exit interview. So you could talk to HR and ask for them to ask some questions about awareness training with the exit interview. And you can monitor. So monitoring is monitoring incidents. You can sort of look at whether or not your training is effective by saying how many incidents that should be thwarted through effective training are actually being thwarted, or is the number of social engineering incidents going down, or is it not going down? Is it going up? That could help you understand whether or not you need to improve your awareness training. So once we've got all these policies, we have to disseminate the information about these policies to all of our employees. We're going to talk about various ways to do that. And our book talks about developing a communication plan. And as we develop a communication plan, some things that they tell us we should ask ourselves is, to make sure that we're effectively communicating these plans is, number one, who communicates the plan? Are the right people delivering the message to build credibility for the effort? So if you've got, rank and file employees trying to disseminate this information, it may not be perceived as a directive from management, but if you've got management sort of introducing these policies, they may not have to do the actual, work, but if if executive management is saying, "Hey, we're implementing these new policies. It's important that everyone follow the policies." If managers are telling their employees this, and then bringing in, a rank and file employee to present those changes, or to email them, or newsletters, or what have you, that may be more effective. We have to ask ourselves, what is the target audience? Is everyone receiving the appropriate message? I talked about different types of employees. We have to know what these different types of employees are, and we have to understand who the different types of employees in our organization are. Obviously in large organizations, you've got lots of different types of people, from the people that sweep the floors all the way up to executive management, and all of them need some level of awareness. In the organization that I work in, we don't have anybody who sweeps the floors. We all take turns doing it. We're a very small company, but we're all very technical, so it's a little bit easier for us. We can, the training can be very technical because everybody who works there is very technical, except for maybe, the one or two people that do sales or answer the phones or do accounts receivable or something like that. But it's certainly something that we have to be aware of. What is communicated? Is the right message being delivered? Are we delivering a consistent message, in other words? How is it communicated? Are we delivering the message in the most efficient manner? Is it, are we making this easy for people to get this information? When is it communicated? I'm sorry. Yeah. So when it is, I'm sorry. What collateral is used? What they're talking about here is the message being consistently delivered, which we already talked about. what objective is being achieved, are specific goals being achieved. So we can make sure that we can, when we're developing this communication plan, we have to think about, okay, what exactly is it that I want to convey to people about these security policies in the process of implementing these policies. So some ways that we can actually get the information out there. So now a little bit more practical. So how do we actually get these policies into people's hands? We talked about ways to develop policies, the process to develop policies, but how do I actually get them in front of people, accessible to people and usable by people within the organization? And the first method is hard copy, which is, hard copy is easy to understand. It's just paper, right? So we can print the policies out and disseminate them on paper. A couple of problems, though. Number one, paper cannot be easily updated. We've talked about the cyclical cycle of IT security policy, that these policies, the policy level may not change very often, and our standards may not change as often. Policies sort of set the tone, it's the core values. The standards are how to carry out those values, and the procedures are step-by-step implementations of the standards. So the procedures would change constantly. And if we do hard copy, we'd have to constantly change those procedures. Hard copy is hard to make changes. So that's one disadvantage. But one advantage of hard copy is that most people understand hard copy. It's accessible to most people. And you can have people physically sign it. So if you have to have some kind of physical signature on it, it's a lot easier to do that, and easier, for legal reasons to keep it. But another disadvantage is it's expensive and it takes a lot of time. Paper costs money. It's very wasteful. And again, it's kind of set in stone once you print something out and give it to everyone. It's hard to go back and change that dynamically. To contrast that, though, an intranet. So an intranet, I'm sure most of us know what this is, but it's a private internet. So it's an internet maybe that's only accessible to folks within the organization or within the company. So if we put all these policies into some kind of an electronic distribution method, one example of that might be something like SharePoint. So Microsoft has a product called SharePoint. We'll talk more about that, I think, in the final unit. But if we have a good intranet, it's low cost. It's certainly less expensive than printing paper and distributing it to everyone. You can keep everything current. You don't have to worry about stuff being out of date. I mean, it can be out of date if you don't maintain it, but you don't have to worry about somebody having an old copy of an old procedure or policy, because anyone who tries to access a procedure in IT security policy system, anytime somebody tries to access a procedure or review a standard, they're always going to get the latest version. Maybe they could go, in something like SharePoint, you can certainly set it up where someone can go look at an older version of a document, but by default, they're always going to get the latest version. So they're always working with the current version of the document. Again, with paper documents, that's very difficult. One of the stories I usually tell in class is when I was a kid, a teenager, I worked at a Radio Shack, and I remember they used to have these books that would have lists of parts and batteries and things like that, and it was all paper documents. It was this huge catalog that they had. It was thousands and thousands of pages. And back then, they didn't use computers for those catalogs. So when a customer came in and had, a certain kind of cell phone or a certain kind of radio or something, and you wanted to look up a part that had to go into that item, you would go into these big catalog books to try to find it. You would look it up, and they were constantly changing. So every couple days, you would get these pieces of paper, and it would come with instructions. You'd get the piece of paper, and then it would have a cover sheet that would say, go and find pages number 926 to 927, remove those two pages and replace with these two pages. And it just got tedious. So half the time we would just throw them in the trash, be like, we don't have time to do this. So then over time you would end up with just lots of outdated information in those catalogs, and customers and employees would get frustrated because, they would have a phone, like a mobile, not a mobile, but, maybe a wireless phone, like a cordless phone, I'm sorry, that's only a couple years old, but we can't find the battery type because nobody ever replaced the sheet in the catalog. So you'd have to call somebody and, call another store. But if it's all electronic, we don't have to worry about that stuff. It's always current. The other thing too is if it's in paper, it's really difficult to search for stuff. But if it's on, electronic, everybody can search it. So it's searchable. and you can link back and forth between different documents. So, and that's pretty powerful. If you're looking at a standard, you can link to the procedure, or you can link to a guideline about implementing that standard. You can link back to a policy. The policy can link to standards, and all these things can be interwoven. It's where the term web comes from, right? Everything is connected. So that's certainly a powerful feature of having these documents online in something like SharePoint. So these are two major options: hard copy and intranet. And I think in most organizations, you would probably have a combination of these two. You would probably use the intranet for the day-to-day, searching and viewing and all that stuff. But you might also have a hard copy somewhere. Maybe not everybody has a hard copy. You might print out one or two hard copies, store a copy somewhere where it's accessible to employees on hard copy if they want to review it that way. Maybe one that's protected somewhere in case you lose the electronic system. So where I work, we're regulated by the FDA, and there was an instance where our electronic document management system crashed, and we lost all those documents. But luckily, we had them all in hard copy, so someone was able to retype them all back into the system. It took almost a year to type all that stuff back in, but if we didn't save them on paper, if we didn't have paper copies, then it certainly would have been much more of a disaster, because if we were to get audited, at least if we have it on paper, at least we can say, hey, we do have these policies. Here they are. They're just not easily accessible, but we have them and we're following them. Whereas if we didn't have that, we would have nothing to prove. I mean, we would have nothing to show to say, hey, we have these policies in place. So certainly if you're regulated, it's a good idea to have some hard copies. So this would be for that, hard copy and intranet is for that wholesale sort of, here's all the policies, everybody having access to everything, which of course is very important. What's the point of doing all these policies if there's no way for people to access them and view them and review them and understand them and et cetera, et cetera. So it's certainly an important part of IT security policy. And, there's whole content management systems you could build to do this that are kind of outside the scope of this course. But in addition to the, disseminating the information through hard copy and intranet, you'll have updates and, you'll have additional information. Policies will change over time. So you can disseminate that information through things like email. Our book talks about brown bag, or some folks call it, I call that lunch and learn, where maybe the HR department or something puts together a short event where maybe they'll provide lunch if everybody comes into a room and learns about some new policy or, something like that. You can do conference calls to discuss new policies. You can put out newsletters that maybe remind people about different policies. Do posters that talk about what you should not or should be doing with information technology. It's important to understand which one of these is better. Your book talks about this example of newsletters. In some companies, you're constantly getting newsletters for all sorts of things. And I think, when you're getting inundated with these newsletters every day, you have a tendency just to throw them away. You're not going to read them because you get them all the time. So if it's something important, you want to find something that's going to capture people's attention. So we're just going to talk about 5 strategies for effective implementation of IT security. The first one is effective communication. So effectively communicating the policies to users, and we just talked about lots of different ways to effectively communicate. Obviously, if we're not making these policies accessible, and if people can't see them, if they're not in front of everyone, then it's not going to be you're not going to have a successful implementation. The other piece is executive support. If we've talked about this already, if management is not behind you on these policies, they're never going to get adopted, because people are not going to feel like they need to implement something that management is not supporting. You have to have realistic expectations on what you can actually implement. I just talked about how 51% of users don't know how to update their antivirus. So that should kind of set your expectations on what you can expect out of employees at certain levels. In some organizations, everyone's very technical, but in others, they're not. So for example, if you work in a retail setting, it's going to be difficult, I think, to, a couple things are working against you. Employees are not well motivated because they're not paid very well. all kinds of things. So you have to have realistic expectations around that, and having those expectations is, certainly helps you think of ways to mitigate that stuff. You have to know what your expected results are, so you can measure. You have to have some kind of measuring stick to measure whether or not you're implementing these policies and they're getting adopted by employees. And you have to be flexible. So you have to have some flexibility. We've talked about this a number of times that when you develop policies, there has to be some kind of pathway to a waiver for certain policies. In other words, a way for people, I don't want to say bend the rules, but you can't always enforce all of these policies. You have to, but rather than looking the other way and rather than saying, well, just don't tell me about it, you should have some kind of documented procedure that people can take if they need to work around some IT security policy, which we've talked about before. So when you do implement these policies, our book talks about the difference between implementation in public versus private organizations. In public organizations, one thing they do talk about is you've got a lot of regulation. One example is HIPAA, where you're bound by compliance regulations or requirements such as HIPAA, Sarbanes-Oxley. In a public organization, a lot of times Sarbanes-Oxley is a major concern. There's certain government regulations like FISMA, where you have to implement some NIST guidelines and standards. So those are that's the type of things you have to worry about in the public organizations. In private organizations, sometimes it's less of a concern, those requirements and regulations and things like that. Mostly in private, our implementation strategy is going to be wrapped around countering risks that might affect the organization. And they're usually much smaller. So typically a private organization is going to be a bit smaller than a public organization. And they can implement changes a lot more quickly, obviously, if you're a smaller company. So again, this is kind of rehashing some of the things that we already talked about, but there are some non-technical hindrances that we can overcome when we're trying to implement these policies. Our book talks about 4 things very broadly. First, they talk about, let me just click here on the right thing on my screen, recognize different learning levels of your users, fostering a learning culture, so people feel like they should be learning about all this stuff. Striving for acceptance of these policies, and gaining executive management support. And of course, I think that's one of the most important things, is to get that executive management support for your policies. So those are non-technical hindrances. This is all about people for the most part, and how to help people learn and understand these policies, which is obviously a challenge in most organizations. There's also some technical hindrances. Our book talks about one thing, which is use centralized administration tools. We're going to talk more about those tools in the next unit, in the final unit. They also talk about replacing outdated technology if possible, and also strive for standardization. So instead of having, I think it's common to have all these different platforms in our IT infrastructure, but if we can standardize as much as possible to one platform for certain things, it certainly helps with implementing IT security policy. So just to give you an example, all the rage now is single sign-on with IT network, with IT infrastructure. Single sign-on is the idea that you've got one system that manages all login accounts for all systems. So you could standardize on single sign-on. You could say that every system we have should support Active Directory or LDAP or something along those lines. LDAP is a good option because a lot of systems can support LDAP, and Active Directory supports LDAP. You can enable LDAP so systems can use LDAP as an authentication mechanism and for authorization. So if you can standardize to something like that, it helps you implement these policies because you've got one platform to worry about. You don't have all these disparate systems managing user accounts and authorization and all that stuff. Give you a good example, very small example, but you might have a company where you've got SharePoint for some things, and then you've got an FTP server for other documents. So the authentication on the FTP server might be on a Linux machine, and it's all Linux accounts, and then you've got authentication for SharePoint for other documents. So you've got sort of a distributed environment there, and you've got 2 different places to go to implement your policies and enforce those policies. Doesn't seem like a big deal with 2 different systems, but what if we had 500 users? Now all of a sudden it becomes a little more daunting. And not only that, but what if I add a third system, a fifth system, a 16th system? You can see it just compounds. It makes this a lot more difficult. So if you can standardize all those systems to one authentication mechanism, it makes things a lot easier. So that's certainly an important concept. Enforcement. So once we implement these policies, now we have to worry about how to enforce these policies. This unit in the book is pretty short on enforcement techniques and things that we can do for enforcement, but I'll cover what's in the book here. But they talk about three primary things we can do for enforcement. We can use automated controls to enforce policy. We can use manual controls, which involve people, to enforce policy, both users and administrators. And we can use monitoring to enforce. So we can use some monitoring techniques to make sure people are abiding by these policies that we've created. We'll start with automated controls. Automated controls involve things like authentication. So authentication prevents you from accessing the network unless we know who you are. So you're not relying on people to use their best judgment. They have to have some credentials to access the network. So that's certainly a pretty basic automated control. Along with that is authorization. And you don't just allow anybody to access anything, and it's kind of on your honor not to go and access the payroll files or something like that. You would make sure you have some authorization to make sure you block people from accessing things that they shouldn't be able to access. So those are both automated controls. Pretty basic. I think all of us implement authentication and authorization on our networks, and it's easy to do that. Active Directory obviously has all kinds of built-in tools to make sure that this happens. But authorization, I think this is a good point, is sometimes it's easy to get lazy about it and just allow people to access whatever they want, and hope for the best. In healthcare, we do this all the time. Great example is a doctor that's looking at medical records. We don't always go through all of the effort to prevent doctors from looking at records that don't belong to their patients because we expect them to use, to exercise some constraint. And instead we rely on auditing. But, as an automated control, we could put in an automated control to prevent that from happening using authorization. It would just take a lot more work to do that. So sometimes we don't go that far. Another one is data encryption. So that would be an automated control to make sure if somebody does get a hold of data or gets access to data that they shouldn't have access to if it's encrypted, obviously they won't be able to get access to it. Logging events, so we know when something happens that's bad. We can do data segmentation, so we can segment access to data, and then network segmentation where different networks are separate from each other. So if you're on, say, the marketing network, you don't have access to resources that are on the engineering network or the development network or something like that, research and development. Something that somebody in marketing probably shouldn't have access to research and development because maybe you don't want them accidentally marketing things that you don't have available yet, or giving away some trade secret that they weren't prepared to make public yet, or something like that. And again, that goes back to layers of security. There could be some authorization in place to prevent that from happening, and then segmenting a network is just one extra layer. So if the authorization for some reason breaks down, the network segmentation can hopefully prevent those types of breaches. So these are all automated controls that we can use to enforce the policy. So again, the policy level might be something like, the marketing department should not be able to access information that doesn't belong to their department, or departments should have control as to who can access what data, and how do we implement that. We can use these automated controls like authentication, authorization, and network segmentation, and all this stuff that I talked about. So these are automated controls, and there are far more examples. Firewalls are automated controls, proxy servers are automated controls, and so forth and so on. Manual controls are where we rely more on humans to for these controls. One option they talk about in our book is background checks. That's a manual control that makes sure that we don't allow people, into our networks that maybe are unscrupulous or can't be trusted. So a background check could maybe help identify that. Log reviews, so periodically a system administrator reviewing those logs. Access rights reviews. And finally, attestations, our book talks about that, which is basically formal management verification. So management is attesting that some condition exists. So for example, SOX requires that that there be some attestation from senior management that some controls exist. That they're saving emails and things like that. So when somebody makes an attestation, they're personally liable for the accuracy of the statement that they made. And it's not so much about whether if you say something that you believe to be true, that's something that's defendable. And maybe there's less liability there. I guess that our book talks about it's not if you knew, but whether you should have known. In other words, simply asking someone if the controls are in place is not sufficient, and so forth and so on. So and again, these are manual controls. But I think in IT, most of us are used to having these automated controls that that we have more control over. Obviously, it's hard to control humans. Some strategies for enforcement before we talk about the monitoring. Our book talks, I guess, about 7 different strategies. Information security teams should develop a close relationship with the legal team. Teams should communicate their roles and responsibilities to one another. Information security teams should review the current legislation that governs their business. So you should understand regulations about the business. The legal department reviews all new or major changes to policies to make sure they comply with the law and they comply with the regulations. Enforcement of policies is based on risk assessment, and all policies should be followed. That goes without saying. Ensure that consequences of not following policies is properly communicated throughout the organization, so people should know what the consequences are if they're not following the policies. And finally, and I think this is very important, is whenever possible or wherever possible, use automated controls to enforce policies. So the least amount of reliance on humans to follow policy as possible. So if at all possible, if there's any way to use technology to enforce compliance with a policy, that's probably the best method, is to use technology. So things like authorization and authentication, which I already talked about, network segmentation, try to use that stuff whenever possible. And firewalls, it's one thing in your policy. Firewall is a great example. We could say there's a policy that you shouldn't download, prohibited content, but we can enforce that policy through some kind of proxy server or email servers that prevent that from happening. So that's a lot better than just relying on people not to do that and hoping for the best. And along those lines, another way to enforce these policies is through the monitoring of employees. And this is kind of a tricky area. I don't always feel comfortable with this whole monitoring employees thing, and I think a lot of us don't. It kind of feels dirty to monitor people that you're working with. But our book talks about some advantages to monitoring employees: maintaining a productive workforce, detecting when security policies are not being followed, maintaining security of sensitive data, ensuring quality and protecting organizations' reputation, avoiding liability from pirated intellectual property such as software and music. See, these are all good things, but I think you have to think about the other side to monitoring employees too. For example, where I work, by no means do we want people sitting on Facebook all day, but do we make it a policy that you can't use Facebook? No. I mean, certainly the policy is, the written policy is employees should avoid, personal websites, or personal phone calls. But, I think most people can attest to this, that, when you're working on something, sometimes you just got to take a break for a few minutes. And, sometimes Facebook or CNN.com or something like that is a good way to do that. And there have been studies that show that allowing employees to do something like that actually does increase productivity. But at the same time, you should be monitoring employees because you don't want people to run rampant with some of that stuff. It's entirely possible that if you review the logs, you might find that one employee is pretty much on Facebook all day long, and that might be affecting their productivity. So you might have to say something. There might have to be some consequences for that. And of course, monitoring can help you detect when security policies are not being followed. So you'll know if somebody's doing something they're not supposed to. Again, but monitoring employees, it's kind of tricky because sometimes you have to know whether you're going to cross that line. And again, that acceptable use policy will help employees understand exactly what you're going to be monitoring. And you could take a whole, legal class on all this stuff. But some areas that you can monitor internet usage, which I just talked about. So you can monitor where employees are going on the internet, what files they're downloading, and certainly look for infractions of the policy. You can monitor email as long as it's company email, right? Because there's some expectation of privacy if somebody uses their personal email. We talked a little bit about that, but again, it's one of those gray areas. And of course, the computers that employees use, if it's owned by the company, it's company property, you certainly have a right to monitor those computers and monitor use of those computers. Again, you got to be careful here because you could cross over into that gray area. I've known IT guys that implement key logging on computers, and key loggers store everything that you type into the keyboard. So, those IT guys, if somebody happened to go to their personal bank account to check their account balance in the middle of their workday, maybe they're on lunch, they're on their lunch break. There's no reason that somebody can't, go to their bank's website and check their account balance on lunch. I don't think most people would really care about that. But, if you're using a keylogger to capture that information, that means you now have that person's bank account information. And, that certainly opens you up to liability. You don't want to keep that information. You don't want to have that information in your logs. So you certainly have to use some discretion. So that concludes the unit where we talk about implementation and enforcement of our IT security policies. In the last unit, Unit 10, we're going to talk about compliance systems and some emerging technologies. It's going to be a rather short section, and then we'll be done. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. Thank you.